And there we go. We're talking
We
about The
should
Who
have
and John
plenty
Lennon
of
because I
battery
wasted
juice.
so much of your time
It doesn't matter.
talking about tomatoes.
Yeah, it's important. It's probably more important in this video by a long shot.
So I'm going to take off
Okay.
my shoes and socks.
I think the Bible says man does not
So
live
wonderful.
by bread alone, but you actually can survive on tomatoes. You can't on Beatles
Yeah.
or music generally. Anyway, it shows the family dynamics with John Lennon. It shows the group dynamics. And Pauline was comparing it with the Birds, which I was
Yep.
doing recently.
And I was comparing it with
The Who in
the
particular.
Who in particular.
So as
Because
far as I know, the Who is still together. It's only 2 of the 4, but they're still together. When the bass player died, he was still theoretically at least a member of the Who. They weren't performing that much, but he hadn't unequivocally quit the group or anything like that. And Keith Moon, I don't think there was any question of him quitting. He died of, I think it was a bad reaction to a medication he was taking for alcoholism. So it's interesting, and I think what were you going to say about it?
oh, sorry. Well, I was going to say that, like with the John Lennon one, you can see that he wanted to be the big leader of the band.
And he was initially. It was his band initially, and then he was introduced by a guy called maybe Ivan Vaughn or something Vaughn, and to Paul McCartney, and he said, well, Paul McCartney's, let me think, a couple of years younger than him. And he said later he looked like Elvis. He looked a bit like Elvis, but he was way more talented. One time, John Lennon's surrogate mother, but of sorts, his Aunt Mimi said to him, you know, Paul McCartney's a better guitarist, not bass guitarist than you, John.
Yeah,
And,
well,
yeah,
you know, when you get a hold of somebody like Paul McCartney, you just be very thankful that he wants to be partner leader of the band kind of thing. Because
you hold on
he's special.
for dear life.
Yeah.
Paul
And
McCartney, from what I can tell, right till the end, until he quit. He quit the group in late '69 and kind of was persuaded back. He was doing all sorts of stupid solo things with Yoko and Plastic Ono Band and stuff like that. Real garbage releases. And Paul McCartney still wanted to work for him.
and so I compared that with the Who because Roger, what's his name?
Daltrey?
Yep.
Yeah.
See, I don't know these guys, and
Yeah.
so I'm just watching the shows with James and whatever.
Yeah.
But he was the leader of the band originally,
Yeah.
and then so he's the big singer and everything. And a lot of the time, the leaders of the bands, they want to be the big singer, that right out front, whatever. And sometimes that's really not a good thing because they don't have a very good voice.
You ask,
for example, Les Claypool.
Yeah.
We were talking about the bass player in The Who was awesome, and we were talking about how Les Claypool probably fashioned himself after him, but that guy wasn't singing or anything. He had the sense to let someone else do that.
Every so occasionally he wrote, like maybe once every other album, he'd write a song and he'd sing it, and he wouldn't sing it even as well as Pete Townshend, and Pete Townshend wasn't the lead singer.
Yeah. So with the Who, there's that guy who played the bass awesomely, and he doesn't really like. There was somebody in the, was it one of the managers or somebody was pointing out that he didn't like the other guys are doing like basically theatrics on stage, right, to draw a person's attention, but the bassist didn't. He didn't do any of that. He wore very flashy clothing, and so they were saying, well, that they were mods. They were a mod group because apparently the mods really dressed to the nines and stuff like that. When
David Bowie was an early mod, so was Rod Stewart. They were younger than the the other guys, so they didn't make it until about half a decade later. But that's where they got the flashy dressing from, the mods.
So anyway, I'm taking a long time
Doesn't matter.
illustrating this
Hmm.
thought.
That's important.
But so you have that guy who he's really special. He's something special. And then you have the like somebody in the show was pointing out that the guy who played the drums was really more like the leader of the band because everyone was watching him. He was, I guess, he really did a lot to be entertaining playing the drums.
He was
And
like a tornado in motion.
so
It wasn't poetry in motion. It was just a tornado in motion.
so
And
then there's that, right? And then when what's his name?
Townsend.
Pete Townsend took up writing songs
Yeah,
and was really good at it.
eventually.
Then, well, even the kind of juvenile stuff at the beginning was,
It showed flashes, like
Yeah.
he was embarrassed about I can't explain, but or dismissive of it. Really, I think he was saying it seemed juvenile.
yeah, he said
But
it seems like
it's
kids'
different
music
from
or what.
I got a feeling
But-
inside. I can't explain. And then the sudden kind, I can't explain. Sudden kind isn't that good, but it's and then in bridges he's singing. I think it's love. I'm saying to you. When I feel blue, the lyrics don't hang together, but it's got little sparks of things that are different from your typical love song.
Yeah, that's true. So because they were very much a boy band, a guy band, not a boy band. I shouldn't say that because then you think of like the um, I don't know, some of those bands
Well,
where they're like
In Sync.
yeah, those things. But in they're of course not that.
It started with the Monkees.
They were tough
perhaps.
guys, right? They're
Yeah,
into fighting and stuff like that. So they're a macho kind of band, really. And so I shouldn't say boy band, I should say a man band. And I guess that's why their audience was almost entirely male.
Well,
And-
they'd show camera. They'd have the camera pan out on the audiences, and you wouldn't see a female face.
Yeah, well, I think
Okay.
it was the other Who video. One of the guys
It was
was
hilarious.
saying, we'd always tell ourselves, oh, the girls are at the back, right?
back.
Which is funny, right?
They'd
But
be shorter than the man. You couldn't see him. Yeah.
so, anyway, so basically, the leader of the band was certainly not Roger. He was the least leader of the band, and I guess what had happened is from what he said, they were doing a lot of amphetamines so that they
Everyone
could
was then. They called
so
them
they could tour a
prellies.
lot and whatever.
The
And
Beatles were doing them like crazy.
he said amphetamines and playing music don't mix, and we were just making noise, and I got so sick of it I just walked out.
He wasn't
during a
just
performance.
talking about it.
And they showed
actually
it,
showed him
and
walking
I
off stage.
laughed, right, because he actually did it. He
Yeah.
just walked out, and you could hear it sounded terrible. So he wasn't making it up. But then I think it was one of their managers was saying that really Roger had to come to terms with the fact that he wasn't the leader of the band anymore, right? And that's true too. I think both things were true. He didn't want to be a part of a band just making noise and whatever, but it wasn't his band anymore, and he had to realize that, and he did. And whereas John Lennon, not at all.
He had been the leader of the band at the start. 2 years older than Paul McCartney, the other creative force in the group, and he. For a while, the competitive relationship was fruitful. John Lennon would say, for example, Sgt. Pepper's, he says, that was a low period for me. I think he only had 4 songs on Sgt. Pepper's out of 13. George Lennon had 1. So that leaves about 8 for Paul McCartney. Maybe at 5, I'm not sure. But those ones, he hits the note right on the head with a mallet. Every one of them. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. I don't have to say anything about a day in the life. Do I? Maybe I do, but I shouldn't have to. Um, One that's really overlooked, Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. Awesome lyrics, found lyrics, but he turned them into poetry. And another one that's hugely overlooked, Good Morning, Ga, or whatever they sing. It's got really sharp lyrics, a sharp solo from uh, George Harrison, one of his sharpest. It's really angry, buzzing, angry. It just sounds like a swarm of bees.
And
Uh,
so that's really what James hated the most about the John Lennon video is it didn't talk about the songs.
it didn't
And
talk about them at all.
I mean, they mentioned that John Lennon was thought to be the thinker of the group and whatever, and it's like, and they went in the direction of all we need is love and laying around and doing um, the hair piece, which that was a witty little pun,
Hmm.
but um, where they laid in bed and they didn't do anything and whatever,
Yeah,
and that's
they.
fine for people who don't have to work,
Yeah,
who have money, but
he
what
was
kind of,
saying everyone do this.
yeah,
Yeah, you
that's
got to get out
ridiculous.
of bed and go to work. That's the
Okay,
whole
well, you can
idea.
do it in like a back alley somewhere because you're not going to be able to pay the bills
Yeah.
and do that.
And the other thing is, no one's
Nobody's
going to
going to
listen
pay
to you.
you
Oh,
to,
there's
and yeah,
some idiot sleeping in bed in a hotel room,
or
or
whatever.
wherever. They were in hotel rooms, but they wouldn't be able to afford those kind of hotel rooms. What sort of media person's going to come out and look at John and Jane Doe? You
So
know,
really, I mean, as far as John Lennon, thinker or whatever, not in that direction.
Not a
Uh,
thinker really at all.
making
I mean, artists aren't
ar-
thinkers generally.
making artful lyrics,
Hmm.
that or whatever.
People who write
But that's
poetry are borderline thinkers, but they're more they feel through their thinking, or they think through their feeling, or something like that. I'm not interested, like I said, in Lennon flapping his gums unless he's doing puns and that sort of stuff. He was definitely not a thinker. When I was mentioning about 1969, the theme song for that year, it was kind of like someone in Rolling Stone pointed out, it's Bad Moon Rising by Creedence Clearwater Revival. And guess what? It's been that way ever since. So 69, Lennon's saying, oh, the 60s were tough and all this sort of stuff, but we got things rolling. It's going to be just like peace, love, and flowers from now on in. Okay, so what happened from 69 through 1992? That's 24 years, beginning of 1993 when Bill Clinton took over. The Democrats are far the better party by that point in time. Uh, for that 24-year stretch from 69 to early 93, we're in for 4 years. Uh, so we're talking about 8 years of Richard Nixon, 8 years of that flunky Ronald Wilson Reagan, and 4 years of the somewhat more competent George Herbert Walker Bush. And that opposed to Jimmy Carter, who is the worst Democratic president in my lifetime by a long shot. Long shot. How about that for punditry and prognostication on John Lennon's part? He's totally wrong. Totally wrong. And he misunderstood things. Like so many of the people that loved his music, so many of the people that he was supporting or ended up supporting, like Jerry Rubin, Black Panther, was it Bobby Seale or whatever? Uh, they were the kind of people that people were reacting against when they started voting for Richard Nixon. Folks, a lot of left wingers, real left wingers. What's a left winger? A worker. I'm not talking about intellectuals, and I'm not talking about artists. The real left wingers of this world are workers. And you've got problems if you're claiming to be a left winger, like so many of the radicals in the late 60s. You've got problems if you're forcing real left wingers, labor, real workers, blue collar workers, to people like Richard Nixon and later on Ronald Reagan. Now, who's that idiot? Donald Trump. When you're doing that, you are evil. You, you might not intend to be evil, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Hi.
Hi. Paved with good intentions. And the big trouble is when I say the road to hell, people who are forcing
Wow, I managed to get juice
workers
down here.
to vote for people like Nixon, who is just all mobbed up. Ronald Reagan wasn't all mobbed up. He actually went after the mob, but it wasn't all. He was hanging around with a high mob figure called Paul Laxalt, a high in Nevada mob, and Jackie Presser, I think, who was high in the Teamsters and stuff like that. So he was just he was actually favoring the California Nevada mob at the expense of all the rest. So Ronald Reagan was mobbed up, and George Herbert or Donald Trump, he's Russian mobbed up originally. He was probably New York, New Jersey, definitely New York, I presume New Jersey as well, mobbed up, and even those guys, I guess, decided he was too much of a risk financially, and now it's just the Russian mob headed by the greatest mobster of all time, Vladimir Putin. So I think we're basically out of time, but we'll have to talk about the Who in greater detail. But Pauline raised a good point. It was good to look at the group dynamics. I will mention that the Byrds, it was interesting to look at the group dynamics there, and they missed the whole thing. They were talking about being the world's worst guy in music. Someone was asked who was the...
Oh, you have 12 minutes. You
12
have
minutes.
lots
So I'll
of
talk
time.
about this group dynamic thing with respect to the Byrds. What happened there is the leader stayed the same. He was the only guy who played anything, any instrument. There were three guys singing on Mr. Tambourine, and the first successful release, maybe the first release of all. He was the only guy who was competent enough to play, according to the producers, and I think they were basically right. Their drummer, I think it was his first drum kit or something like that, Michael Clark. I don't think he ever became much of a drummer. I think he might have been picked for his looks. He looked more beautiful actually than your average model or Hollywood movie star or something like that. Female, I'm talking about. But so we're quoting one guy in the Byrds DVD, who was asked, who was the worst guy you ran across in the music industry, and I guess he didn't pause for a beat or anything like that. It was David Crosby. Second worst, Charlie Manson. And Charlie Manson was in the
which is
music
funny.
business, so. And he was actually hanging with it. It's a great joke. And the sad thing is, it's kind of joking on the square, because David Crosby was hard to get along with. But I'm afraid Jim and later Roger McGuinn, I think he changed his name from one to the other. I think I got the sequence right. If I did, who cares? And he changed it in the base of numerology, actually. At any rate, the only person I know to have done that, I haven't known anyone in person, who I've read about. Anyway, the rock reviewers should have known about this. Jim McGuinn, later Roger McGuinn, was hard to get along with too. And maybe he might have been on that guy's list right after Chuck Manson. A telling note is, or several notes, are struck in one DVD re-release of a record put out. I think it's for their fourth or fifth album, Younger Than Yesterday, or what's that? The Notorious Bird Brothers, the fifth album. I think it's the fifth one. It's called Dolphin Smile, and so it's an outtake. And they're working on Dolphin Smile, which is kind of laid back like a lot of David Crosby stuff, later stuff, and even some of his middle stuff, not so much his early stuff. Anyway, they're working away on it, and Michael Clark, who wasn't the greatest drummer in the world, I think, ever, was having a little trouble with the beat. It's kind of laid back, a little bit maybe shuffly or something like that. Anyway, it isn't going to David Crosby, the composer's satisfaction. And so he starts laying into Michael Clark. You don't do this kind of stuff. If you got a problem with someone, you wait until the session's over. Yeah, the clock's ticking, all that sort of stuff. Get the record done, or like go through the session and talk to the guy under four eyes, as they say in Germany. I think Russia too. We might say it in English tradition too. Under four eyes. You don't call someone down in front of other people. But there's David Crosby lacing into it. And really quickly, all of a sudden you hear a voice. Now, maybe it's Chris Hillman. Gene Clark wasn't around at that point in time. But it sure sounds like Roger McGuinn's voice. And he's lacing into Michael Clark, too. He should have been lacing into David Crosby. But no, they both start picking on Michael Clark. So I'm afraid Roger McGuinn was hard to get along with. And that's why you had this huge turnover in the Byrds. And he more and more became the leader. He already would have been the musical leader. The big trouble with him was, you get rid of David Crosby, who was capable of writing some interesting things. And Gene Clark, who wrote some very good songs that, about 65, 66, he was actually writing more complete, kind of like love songs than they were all like sad love songs. They weren't like She Loves You, Yeah, 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 or whatever. One person in the Byrds said, we knew when Gene Clark came up with another song that he'd had another breakup. Poor fellow. But yeah, really sad songs. And he'd generally give you a verse, bridge, and verse. He'd give you a third verse. As I was saying the other day, the Beatles often they'd only give you two verses. So there were these three creative writing forces in the original Byrds: Gene Clark, David Crosby, and Roger McGuinn. And then eventually it was just Roger McGuinn. And these other guys couldn't sing as well as... I mean, when you get guys who can't sing, they sound almost as bad. They played one thing where this is in the later Byrds. They were saying on one album, Roger McGuinn kind of just let whoever wrote a song sing it. Well, it sounds a little bit like what happened with Creedence Clearwater Revival. Creedence Clearwater Revival had some very bad group dynamics. And again, it was the older brother, Tom Fogerty, was the leader, presumably founder of the group. He had his younger brother in the group, John Fogerty. And Tom couldn't take John Fogerty taking over. Now, apparently, John Fogerty was a real taskmaster, a slave driver, but how do you argue? I mean, it seemed like everything they released never really went to number one, never really went to number two, but it was just number three. It's almost like that Beatles song, number nine, Revolution number 9. This was number three. People loved Creedence. And even someone who was working with
You were talking about the speaking of number 9,
Mm-hmm.
it just reminded me, did you mention the Yoko Ono thing? Beatles do this, Beatles do that.
Yeah.
That
Well,
was funny.
it's stunning. Paul Gambaccini was in this John Lennon
She looked
DVD.
beautiful.
She actually looked pretty good. Of course, she didn't look good with full dorsal nudity. And before you looked
No.
at the screen, there was
No.
actually full frontal nudity.
Oh, really?
And she looked particularly bad, full dorsal nudity. Like if women
Yeah,
are
that
going to be
bum is
showing off
very
their
bad.
rear ends.
Very, very bad bum.
The gluteus maximus is a muscle.
Yeah, if you don't
And
use it, it looks terrible.
It looks really saggy. John's buttocks didn't look terribly good either. So
No, they needed to have less lay in bed protests and
yeah,
more
exactly right. Let's get
walking around the
Yeah.
lake
Yeah,
protests.
let's have something like a Terry Fox.
Yeah,
marathon.
exactly. Have one
Marathon
of
for
that.
peace,
A
right?
marathon protest.
Yeah, something like that. So, yeah, like one of the executives with the Beatles said, like what are you doing? They didn't want to release Two Virgins. That was the cover of the Two Virgins album. He said, you guys just don't have the bodies for it, or something like that. And he was right. Uh, but like Paul Gammancini, I've been following him um, since probably about 1970 as a reviewer, maybe a little bit later than that. And he actually brought a note of sanity to some of the Rolling Stone reviews. They had a wild guy. I liked reading his stuff, but his tastes ran. He loved the Rolling Stones, and then they got, I guess, a little old and drug-addled for him, and then he went for heavy metal. And that would be about 1970, maybe. He probably was a big fan of Black Sabbath or whatever. And then he went for punk, about 75, 76, and stuff like that. And the funny thing is, those things became popular with adolescents. Kept on being popular with adolescents, but I don't know. Yeah, Lester Bangs was a little bit off. John Ned Mendelsohn was, I love that guy. I guess he basically worked for Cream, but every so occasionally he'd do a review for Rolling Stone. But Paul Gammancini, he'd give pop stuff a consideration. So he's about the only reviewer there. And he's talking about, on the DVD, and he's talking about Yoko Ono, and he's talking about her reception with the Beatles. And he's saying, well, it's an example of racism, and it wasn't a good reception, I understand. Racism, genderism, or sexism, and ageism, because she was older than even John Lennon.
The wrong side of 30. And it's like, no, she was not a good person. She wasn't bright, and she was arrogant, so that's pretentious. And
so that's a particular, when you're not bright and you're arrogant, that's pretentious. When you're not talented and you're arrogant, that's pretentious. So she was at least doubly pretentious.
Yeah.
And like that, her talents were lack of the same, were multiplex, shall we say? So there's this one, I think it was George Harrison talking, or it may have been Ringo, talking about how she kind of parachuted into the sessions. Maybe even the double white session. 2 minutes.
Yeah, keep going.
Okay, and he said, Ringo or George, he was one of those guys, it was, I think it was even in 1968, it was Beatles do this, Beatles do that. And that's Yoko Ono. I don't know if they ever signed a contract, but it would be understood. That was a business proposition as well as an artistic proposition, the Beatles were. And they didn't sign on. None of those guys signed on for a fifth Beatle called Yoko Ono. They didn't sign on for that, particularly someone that untalented. What? She couldn't sing. Have you ever heard her sing? She sometimes vocalized in a bag, and it's embarrassing. She, I guess, could play piano, but could she play piano as well as Paul McCartney? All sorts of different styles. She wrote stuff, but not nearly as well as maybe even Ringo. So what is this? She's just, Beatles do this, Beatles do that. They were really patient. And why did they put up with it? Because of John Lennon. Because they figured he was worth it. They didn't want to alienate him. But really, all other things being equal, someone else from the management should have just said, you're out of here, lady, or whatever. You are out of here, woman. Mm-hmm. Okay, so how much time?
5 seconds.
Well, that's it. It should have been, you're out of here.